So dominionism is referring to one of two sides of the same coin. These ideas are very related to each other. One is that God has called Christians to take dominion over all things. And the other side is that Christians have dominion over all things and they need to claim it. The second component is something that we do see more from the charismatic movement, where they have a very imminent belief in angels and demons, and we see a ever-present belief and ideas being spoken from their leaders about how there are demons in places of power that are keeping Christians from being able to lay hold to what is rightfully theirs. And so their job is to cast out the demons that are keeping Christians from taking dominion in these areas. And these areas would be these 7 mountains that are part of the 7 Mountain Mandate. So this was on full display at the Capitol riot, January 6, 2021. There were literally exorcisms going on in front of the U.S. Capitol to try to prevent the rightful and peaceful transfer of power to Joe Biden.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host is not with us. He's out, I think, getting his testosterone levels checked or something, but we don't really need him.
Is he trying to go into the military?
No, he's actually on sabbatical. I do this thing that never really quite lands. Whenever he's not here, I come up with this reason that he's not here, because I know he doesn't listen to the episodes that he's not on, so I can kind of jab him a little bit. But that's a little insight to our audience. Anyways, we are here today with Keri Ladner. She is at the University of Edinburgh and specializes in the intersection of fundamentalist religion and American politics, and is the author of End Time Politics from Moral Majority to QAnon, but has a new book out called American Dominion, The Rise and Radicalization of a New Christendom. In it, she traces how fringe movements such as Christian Reconstructionism, the neo-Apostolic Reformation, 7 Mountain Mandate, developed separate visions of Christian rule and found political cause and even moved closer to American power. So today we're going to talk to Keri about all of this, her book, and try to learn as much as we can about what it means to have American dominion in our country. So welcome to Faithful Politics, Keri.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So one question I ask all of our guests, just because I'm naturally curious, is what makes a person want to make their professional career all about studying fundamentalist religion?
Well, I'm going to be the first to say that I really want to be studying the good guys, if you will. I would love to be spending my days reading about Gandhi and Howard Thurman and these really profound individuals who have been peacemakers and voices for good, maybe, Walter Rauschenbusch, these guys. But there is certainly an urgency in this particular moment to be understanding what we are facing, what we are dealing with, and the very present, very real threats to the future of our democracy, and not only in America, but around the world, because this is truly a global movement.
Yeah, it really is. So your book is called American Dominion. And the word dominion, I think, is really weighted, at least the way I read it and from my understanding of at least the topic. So when you're using the word dominion in your book, you're talking about dominion. What are we actually talking about? What is sort of dominionism kind of in the Christian context?
So dominionism is referring to one of two sides of the same coin. These ideas are very related to each other. One is that God has called Christians to take dominion over all things. And the other side is that Christians have dominion over all things and they need to claim it. The second component is something that we do see more from the charismatic movement, where they have a very imminent belief in angels and demons, and we see a ever-present belief and ideas being spoken from their leaders about how there are demons in places of power that are keeping Christians from being able to lay hold to what is rightfully theirs. And so their job is to cast out the demons that are keeping Christians from taking dominion in these areas. And these areas would be these 7 mountains that are part of the 7 Mountain Mandate. So this was on full display at the Capitol riot, January 6, 2021, where there were literally exorcisms going on in front of the U.S. Capitol to try to prevent the rightful and peaceful transfer of power to Joe Biden. But what becomes very scary, very dangerous about this is not just the belief that one group of people is called to exercise this power and authority or dominion over other people, but that they are couching so much of this in language about demons. And I can look at this empirically, rationally, and say, I don't think that there were demons that prevented the second election of Donald Trump in 2020. I think it was individuals who voted for Joe Biden in what is the most fair election in American history. And so who are the demons in this context? If we start reading more and more and listening to these guys, the demons are the people who voted for Joe Biden. So we're actually literally demonizing people. We have to cast out the people who are preventing Christians from having dominion over all things. And this is very much what we're looking at right now. And if I can talk about the other side of what dominionism is, the belief that God has called Christians to take dominion over all things. This is something that we're seeing much more with the non-charismatic side, more of your Doug Wilsons, who are happy to say that Christians don't yet have the authority over all things that God has given them, that Christ does have the authority. He makes his appeals to Abraham Kuyper, some distortions of Kuyper's thoughts, which I discuss in American Dominion. But that doesn't mean that authority yet belongs to Christians. It is for Christians to take. And when I'm talking about Christians, I don't mean all Christians, okay? I'm not talking about progressives. I am not talking about social gospel Christians. I'm talking specifically about the extremists who are part of this movement.
So when you say, like they are, they want to take dominion, they want to tackle these seven mountains. I think regular listeners of our show will at least have some framework to understand like what the seven mountains is. But can you just expand on that a little bit more when you use the term seven mountains? Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the idea has a very long history. It goes back at least 100 years to Abraham Kuyper, who he's a Dutch theologian and statesman who made his mark on the U.S. in the early 20th century. This idea that society is divided into distinct spheres and that each sphere is basically its own governorate, that there's individuals who, well, as the idea developed, especially with Loren Cunningham and Bill Wright in the 1970s and 1980s, that there are individuals who have authority over these spheres, who have not just influence. There's a lot of individuals who will argue that what Loren Cunningham and Bill Wright were arguing for is merely for Christians to have more influence in secular society rather than just within the church. But then if you look at the sermons of these guys from the 1980s, we see very explicit efforts at nation building using this concept of there being these distinct regions of culture that God has assigned for Christians to take dominion over. The idea passed on to Lance Wallnau in the late 1990s, early 2000s. He transformed it into this idea called the Seven Mountain Mandate. The way that he talks about it, Christians have been too focused on the church. When we talk about serving God, serving our neighbor, we tend to talk about serving within the church. When God calls us to ministry, we tend to think about God as called people to be church ministers or maybe to volunteer in a church setting. And Wallnau is arguing that Christians have only focused on this to the exclusion of everything else, to the exclusion of influencing education, to the exclusion of influencing government, to the exclusion of influencing the media, and God has called on Christians to take dominion over each of these mountains. Now, that is patently untrue in any historical sense. Okay, not what I just said is untrue, but what Lance Wallnau promotes is untrue, because Christians have been deeply invested in all of these different areas of culture. If you look at the social gospel movement from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and then the social gospel turned into the civil rights movement, we see that Christians were very active in all of these areas of culture. Christians progressive evangelicals in particular had a very significant role in the development of our public school system. Well, Lance Wallnau wants to pretend that Christians have never had anything to do with this because, I mean, it suits his agenda, right? And also, it wasn't the fundamentalist Christians who were trying to actually take over the government who were trying to take over these mountains. So he's building on these ideas that have a very long history, that have been developed by some very prominent individuals. Loren Cunningham's the founder of YWAM, Youth with a Mission, which is, I believe, the largest missionary sending organization in world history. And Bill Bright is the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. It's now known as Cru. He was also the guy behind the Jesus film. So these are not backwater individuals. These are very prominent individuals within the history of political evangelicalism, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. And Lance Wallnau, he took the same idea that had been gestating for decades, and he not only supercharged it, but he was able to bring it into the mainstream in ways that these other individuals had not. And so when we saw, for example, the Capitol riot, when we're seeing now these efforts to intentionally place the most unqualified individuals possible in the president's cabinet, we're actually seeing an enactment of the Seven Mountain Mandate. Because according to the Seven Mountain Mandate, it's not who's the most qualified educator who's going to take control of the mountain of education. It's the person that God has anointed. And who's the person that God has anointed at the end of the day? In this line of thinking, it's Donald Trump, and whoever he chooses, that must be God's chosen person. So we are seeing this active dismantling of, for example, our education system, for example, our government. The cyclospora outbreak is just a case in point that our government is no longer working, and we're placing the most inept individuals at the top of these so-called mountains to take them over, supposedly for the glory of God in Christ, taking dominion over all of these mountains. And we are unfortunately reaping the harm of what has been done.
Yeah. So your book starts at a really, what's the word I want to use? It starts at a very unique place, where you talk about, Bethel Church, trying to pray a 2-year-old girl back to life. So number one, I'd love for you just to kind of unpack that for us, and then two, like what made you want to start there?
Yeah. So let me answer your first question first. What made me want to start there? This was definitely a very delicate issue to start a book with. The story is back in forget the 2019, I believe it was. December of 2019, a week before Christmas. This 2-year-old girl died suddenly. Family never released the details of her death. The parents were Andrew and Callie Heilegenthal, who at the time were very prominent worship leaders at Bethel Church in Redding, California. Now, Bethel Church is one of the most influential churches in the world. But there's a huge segment of the population, including within Christianity, that's never heard of Bethel Church. But even though we're actually singing Bethel's music in our churches, they have multiple award-winning music labels. They just take all the Dove Awards pretty much every year because of their music. And they rose to prominence for another reason with the first election of Donald Trump in 2016. Because of the high level of access that the leadership actually had to the Trump White House. Sean Foyt comes out of Bethel Church. He had some other NAR connections, with the New Apostolic Reformation connections there prior to his time at Bethel Church. But this is a very influential place. The senior pastor / apostle, Bill Johnson, he is one of the best-selling authors in the world. If you look at their YouTube channel, just millions and millions and millions of hits on it. And we don't understand this place, right? Like, we don't understand what they're teaching. We don't understand its appeal, why people are coming from all over the world to come to this place. And the And what I wanted to show in the introduction is that the appeal of Bethel Church is the same appeal as much of the dominionist movement. And it's not what anyone would expect. It's faith healing. And what I found in doing research going back to the early 1900s, and in some cases back to the 1800s in other locations like in the United Kingdom, is that faith healing is actually serving as it's a very effective way of gaslighting people who in particular might come from a disadvantaged position. So, for example, individuals with disabilities, individuals who might be ill, including terminally ill, people who have a sick child or a child with a disability, a child with terminal illness. They tend to be very not, let me rephrase that. I don't want to say that they tend to be drawn, because I don't want to make categorical statements about all these individuals. There are plenty of people who face these kinds of circumstances and they trust the medical system. But unfortunately, what many families have found is that the medical system is not helping, that their terminally ill relative, terminally ill loved one is still going to die. And they often turn to these faith healers in certain circumstances. Sometimes people spend their last dollar to go and visit a faith healer. And often the message that they have, it's not unique. These are not uniquely powerful or in any way qualified individuals, but they are very happy to tell the individual who is seeking a miracle that they need to show that they have faith by planting a seed, and that seed is a financial gift. And by planting that seed, they are demonstrating to God that they truly believe God for a miracle. And it is the faith that they're showing that God will respond to. So there's a lot of gaslighting, a lot of manipulation that's occurring in the situation. But what I found as I looked more and more into these faith healers, including John Alexander Dowie, Frank Sanford, Charles Fox Parham, these guys, the late 1800s, early 1900s, these guys were connected to the Ku Klux Klan. And they were actually using faith healing not just as a smokescreen for white supremacism, but it was actually deeply embedded in their white supremacist ideology. I found that to be just incredibly fascinating. And, why has nobody researched this before? Why are people not taking the world of faith healing seriously? And it is alive and thriving in 2026. So I started with this really tragic example of a 2-year-old who had died. She was in the inner circle of Bethel Church, to show that what's really drawing people into this movement, it's not politics. It's not the effort to take over America's government or any of the other 7 mountains. It's the desire for a miracle. It's that people are desperate. Who can be more desperate than a mother whose toddler just died? So this is the appeal of the dominionist movement. And I wanted to humanize this world of faith healing before dissecting it, showing that it is very powerful. It has quite a hold over many people's lives. And through that hold that it has over these individuals and communities, they are getting sucked into this white supremacist ideology. And even the language may not be white supremacist. It might be coded language in a coded movement. Donald Trump does not have to explicitly talk about white supremacism to be using coded language and be promoting white supremacist ideas and white supremacist conspiracy theories. But for many, many, many people, this is the entryway into the dominionist movement. And I want for my readers of American Dominion to be willing to give these individuals grace, to give them an off-ramp from the extremism that they have been embedded in, and to make space for them in their conversations, make space for them at their tables, make space for them in their lives.
One of the I really wish Josh was here, only because I mean I like Josh, but because like Josh handles the theology side of most of the topics we talk about. I'm in it on the politics stuff. He's in it on the theology stuff. So the next question is a question that I would normally just ask Josh once we stop recording, because I want to kind of better understand like these dominion factions, if that's really the right term. So like when you think of the New Apostolic Reformation, Seven Mountains Mandate, Christian Reconstructionism, neo-Confederate Christianity, what have you, like, are these all under like the Dominion umbrella? Are these under like Christian nationalism? Like when I think about these groups, like what's the best way to kind of categorize them, if they can be categorized?
That's a really good question. I think of it as a patchwork quilt. And it's not the kind that you might make in a boutique sewing class that you might take, but more of the one that you find at grandma's or great grandma's house decades ago, where all of these old pieces of cloth that don't fit and don't match have come together to create something. So when you have, for example, Doug Wilson's movement, Doug Wilson has very little in common theologically with the New Apostolic Reformation. He has a lot in common with the neo-Confederates. A lot of these guys do have common origins, but they've just taken so many different directions. And at the end of the day, many of their theologies are incompatible with each other. We have premillennialism and postmillennialism working against each other. These guys should, on a theological level, these guys should not have been able to come together the way that they did. But they did. So if we look again at the Capitol riot, we had those appeal to heaven flags next to, the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys who are following these neo-Confederate ideas. So why are all of these groups all working together the way that they are? And one thing that I explored in American Dominion is that many of them actually do have a common history. If we look at the development of what became the New Apostolic Reformation, particularly in the mid-20th century during the Latter Rain Revival, we find that it was, in many ways, it was a splinter off of the Ku Klux Klan. And the individuals that are highly revered by NAR prophets and apostles today, William Branham, Gordon Lindsay, Charles Fox Parham. Gordon Lindsay, I'm not sure if he was actually in the Ku Klux Klan, but he was sympathetic to it for sure, and he was a British Israelist, meaning that he was following some of the core tenets of the theology that these Klansters were using, which became the foundation for the very extremist identity theology. And to give you an idea of just how extremist identity theology is, that is what underpinned the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which I also talk about in American Dominion. So these have a shared history. Like the NAR broke off of what became identity. And many things that we see in NAR theology, when you start peeling back the layers, looking closely at it, wow, that looks a lot like identity, actually. So common origins and common goals as well. The goal of, in effect, taking over the U.S. government, implementing their ideas at scale in American government. So these guys were more than happy to come together, cooperate with each other. We saw a lot of this occurring within the Tea Party that emerged in the aftermath of the election of Barack Obama in 2008. And through the cooperation that was, unexpected, didn't really make sense on a lot of levels, they were able to build a coherent movement at the same time that Bethel Church was becoming just astoundingly famous all over the world, and take over the Republican Party by the time of the primaries in 2016, and then we end up with the election of Donald Trump.
So would you categorize these groups as being like violent groups that are capable of being radicalized, or is the faith itself sort of like the radicalization
These guys are
kind of process?
already extremely radicalized, the
They
leaders.
are.
So, Rick Joyner, who is a prominent NAR apostle in South Carolina, he is over Morningside Ministries. He was calling on the militia in the aftermath, the buildup in the aftermath of the 2020 election. So that's just and he's got sermons that you can access in the Morning Star archives where he's talking about how the churches are basically going to be military stations. So I'm not sure how much more radicalized you can get. He's
Yeah.
also promoting this idea of faith healing and continually using that to draw more and more people into Morning Star Ministries. And then you have individuals who might not seem like they're particularly dangerous, like Bill Johnson, who's the apostle at Bethel Church. He seems like a nice guy. You look at his picture, some of his pictures look kind of scary, but generally he looks like an approachable individual. But he was also promoting election conspiracy theories in the aftermath of 2020, saying that, the fact that Donald Trump won was just as plain as the nose on his face when he could offer no evidence. What is he doing by telling his millions of followers around the world that Donald Trump actually did win? Is that a benign statement? Well, we can look at January 6th and say that was not a benign statement to be making. That's a very extremist, radical statement to be making that is leading to an effort to overturn the American government. So even the guys who might seem less extremist are like what they're actually saying. If we can take away the music from the worship songs and just look at the lyrics, if we can take away all of the fluff out of their sermons and look at what the core of the message is, we find some really dangerous ideas about Christians having dominion over all things, about Christians using worship as a weapon against their enemy. And their enemy literally are liberal individuals or anyone for that matter who might disagree with them.
Yeah, I want to kind of talk about the music side of it, because I think it's pretty fascinating, at least for me. So I used to be a worship leader, and I know I've sung plenty of Bethel songs, Hillsong, and all the rest. All the folks that we're probably going to be talking about. So, like, what is the risk, I guess, of singing Bethel worship music?
Well, the obvious risk here is twofold. The most obvious one in just singing Bethel music at a church service. One is that the theology is in the music. And so when you sing a song about how your worship is a weapon or your weapon is a melody, to quote a line from one of their songs, you're letting in this extremist theology. You take away the pretty sounds, the pretty music, and just look at the words. And this is really not okay when we're talking about using our worship to wage war against our enemies. That's really not okay. But then also when you have to give credit, the licensing credits at the end of songs, on the slide projector, it's saying where that song is coming from. It's coming from Bethel Church. And that's inviting people to go and explore what Bethel Church is about as if it has the endorsement of their church, even if it's, a progressive church. It's like a tacit endorsement that's being given to this extremist movement. But then there's also a more hidden danger, and it's in the history of these ideas. Saying that worship is a weapon, it might be really fringe in the history of Christian thought. It is not fringe in this movement. It is central to this movement. It goes back to the latter rain revival of the mid-20th century. One of the key theologies that emerged out of the latter rain revival is that worship is a weapon that God has given us to wage war. And they are talking about a literal war that will overthrow the forces of Satan. So there's a deep history here. It's not just innocuous words that might sound nice. That is their actual theology that they are putting on display and exporting globally through this worship music.
Got it. And I'm curious though, just because I want to push back just a little bit, because like is it bad because Bethel is singing it, or is it bad because of kind of what it connotates? Because, you know, like in my interpretation of it is like, it seems whenever you're singing any sort of worship song, it's all metaphors, right? And it's all like stories, allegories, you know, kind of designed to kind of conjure up a certain image, you know, while people are praying or whatever. So like is the Bethel thing, you know, just because it's Bethel, or is it because like you're trying to convince us that there's something much deeper that people just need to be aware of?
I'm going to suggest that it's both. And the reason why is because Bethel is such an influential institution, not just as a church, but as a music producer and as a, you know, media distributor. Again, looking at their YouTube channel, it is incredibly prolific. And there's danger in the lyrics. Yes. The theology promoting in the lyrics is not something that we necessarily want our friends to be saying. But then at the same time, do we really want people to be getting sucked into the Bethel vortex where they're going online and listening to Bill Johnson's sermons? They might be even listening to the stuff about Donald Trump, and listening to the stuff about the 7 Mountain Mandate, but then also listening to the content that is extremely anti-queer and in many ways inciting, if not outright violence, and at least violent attitudes towards our queer brothers and sisters. And, you know, if we can step back and look at a more historical perspective and talk about the electronic church of the 1970s and 1980s, this was an incredibly disruptive thing. The electronic church is referring to the innovative use of the airwaves by some pastors, such as Robert Schuller at the Hour of Power at the Crystal Cathedral. And Jerry Falwell was a really prominent one of these guys as well. I wrote my doctoral thesis on Jerry Falwell, so I'm way too familiar with him. I feel like I need to exorcise that demon out of me. But you would have individuals who, they might be longtime church members. They've in their local church, but now they're coming home from church and they're listening to Jerry Falwell, who doesn't have a theological degree. Their pastor might have gone to seminary, but now they're listening to this guy who doesn't even have a theological degree and has a really clear political agenda that he's trying to advance over the airwaves. Now, who has more credibility? A lot of the times it was actually the pastors on the electronic church who developed more credibility. And many of their listeners, their followers, were giving money to the electronic church pastors. This is money that could have otherwise gone to help fund local churches and local programs within their communities that are run by local churches, such as, food assistance, clothing assistance, and paying the pastor, keeping the lights on. So these institutions began to become much more powerful than the churches within people's communities. That was an incredibly disruptive development that occurred. And right now what we're seeing with these mega churches like Bethel Church, like Hillsong, which you mentioned, Elevation Church, is that they're even more disruptive. These guys are incredibly media savvy. They have hired people. They have hired entire teams of people just to do their media work. They have some of the best musicians in the world working at their facilities, writing the music, producing the music. So the level of disruption that this is creating to local churches, I don't think it can be overstated. And so when you have individuals who might be attending their local Methodist church and they're also listening to Milt Johnson, well, what's going to happen when the Methodist pastor who went to seminary and has a master's in divinity says something that contradicts Bill Johnson? And honestly, probably 99% at least of what the seminary trained pastor is going to say is going to contradict Bill Johnson. Who are we going to believe in this situation? There is a credibility gap. And usually we're going to believe the celebrity pastor over the guy who actually went to seminary.
That's so wild. I forgot where I read it. Man, it's either Melissa Deckman from PRI or some other author, but the premise of the article was how like social media and number of followers are going to be kind of like the new currency in this generation. So kind of to your point, like you can have this really smart, educated, theologian that knows what they're talking about, and you can have this very boisterous, like flamboyant, like individual that just has a big social profile, and people are going to believe that person because like they're more charismatic, right? They're more like thinking about like Molly Worthen's like book, right? Like charisma is sort of everything, and they're gonna get all the money and get all the churches and get all the things, which kind of brings me to sort of the next part I want to ask you about is like, how does Donald Trump fit into American dominion? I mean, he's this larger than life character. He's currently the president. Yeah, like what's the Donald Trump angle in the religious community?
Yeah, I think when he was first elected in 2016, the staunchest part of his base was white evangelicals. It was 80% of white evangelicals voted for him, roughly, in 2016. And this was just so incredibly astounding. Like, journalists, scholars, what happened here? These are supposed to be the family values guys. These are supposed to be the people who, want to make sure that we're protecting marriage. So why are they electing somebody who's been divorced multiple times, on his third marriage, multiple affairs? Is just as crass can be. What?
It's almost like Trump doesn't really understand how marriage works.
Right, but everyone was scratching their head, what is this thing about? And I think in 2016, we wanted to think that this was just an anomaly. Maybe there was just some media hype, some fever, a few celebrity pastors, this thing's going to blow over. What we realize now is that this was not an anomaly. This was the culmination of something that had been brewing for decades. The face of the religious right, when it was first formed in the 1970s, 1980s, was the guy I wrote my doctoral thesis about. It was Jerry Falwell. And he's always talking about family values. And we know that family values was code for white supremacism, but he was anti-divorce. His daughter got divorced, and then he had to get a little quieter, a little bit less rambunctious about, preaching against divorce, anti-abortion, the things we commonly associate, school prayer, all these things that we associate with the family values agenda. And then Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, and it seemed like this was just a one-trick pony, and this thing's on its way out. It wasn't on its way out. George Bush got elected in 2000. He was the evangelical president, not just supported by evangelicals, but evangelical himself. Not in ways that Jimmy Carter was evangelical, but evangelical in ways that, like, he's going to invade the Middle East, potentially, possibly influenced by prophecy belief. That kind of evangelical is Messianic Calvinism that ended up being pretty destructive. Well, Falwell dies in 2007. So we're thinking, okay, now this thing is over. Okay, at this point when Falwell died, millennials are coming of age. Millennials are a generation much more concerned with racial parity. Parity, parity, not parody like we're making fun of race relations. I just want to clarify that, okay? We're concerned about these things because the black kid was the friend that we played with on the playground at school, right? I'm speaking as a millennial here. We're aware that climate change is happening. There's a looming environmental catastrophe. We're aware about the growing threat of gun violence because of the Columbine shooting. And so this family values agenda just isn't on the radar anymore. And Barack Obama gets elected. But that the election of Barack Obama was significant in just so many ways, right? Because one level, we've got the white supremacist backlash against him because he is America's first African-American president. And he's also, pretty outspokenly liberal. He's a total sea change from the Bush administration. Yep. But then we also have Sarah Palin, who comes onto the scene. And this is the real disruption that happens. This is what provides that real galvanizing point for all of these disparate groups who, like I said, are theologically incompatible with each other to start to come together and create a cohesive movement, that movement being the Tea Party. She attended a new Apostolic Reformation church in her hometown. And there was this video that surfaced in the buildup to the 2008 election from when she was running for governor of Alaska in 2003, where this Kenyan apostle named Thomas Muthi was praying over her against the forces of witchcraft. And it was like, what is this? What is this thing really about? Well, that was the first real public awareness that there's this other movement that's been building in the background.
Mm.
Alongside of Jerry Falwell's movement, sometimes against it, but still building, still growing, not the face of the religious right. Okay. Now, would Falwell have voted for Donald Trump if he was still alive in 2016? Maybe. Maybe. I don't want to say that he wouldn't have. But the movement that was growing in the background and that no one was paying attention to, it was too weird to take seriously. These were the faith healers. How are we taking the faith healers seriously as a political movement, right? But then these are the guys who became incredibly prominent through their influence of their worship music, particularly. And this network of prophets and apostles that they had formed and that they were using to create a lot of leverage within the evangelical movement was wrapping its arms around Donald Trump before the mainstream evangelicals were. If you remember in 2015, a lot of the mainstream evangelicals were behind Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
And it was the prosperity preaching Pentecostals, like there's my alliteration for the day, who were organizing around Donald Trump. But then he kept gaining steam because of the influence of the NAR was just so pervasive. It had been this stealth movement growing in broad daylight, really. But no one had taken it seriously, except for a few journalists like Rachel Tabachnik, who I've been having some wonderful conversations with. She took it seriously. She was talking about it. But for the most part, we didn't take it seriously. And so with Donald Trump, he's not an anomaly. He is the culmination. And now what we're looking at is evangelicalism going to go back to what it was before Donald Trump? We're not looking at a return to Reagan-era evangelical politics. We're not looking at a return to even Bush-era evangelical politics. We're looking at, J.D. Vance, who's not even evangelical, but then again, neither is Trump. Right? So we're not looking at a return to something that looks more sane and more understandable. We're looking at something that is going to continue this movement because what we're looking at right now, it's not Jerry Falwell's religious right anymore.
That's so well. I really appreciate the point you just made about kind of the Reagan era evangelicalism, because like politics has always been mixed up with religion, right? Always. And the conservative party has always sort of married itself to religion, and to your point, like the rise of the religious right kind of ended with Falwell's passing, maybe. But now that connection of religion and politics is still there on the conservative side, it's just taking a different form, and that form looks more like dominionism than anything else. Is that an accurate summary?
Yeah. There was this movement growing in the background. They were the crazies. They were given the crazy corner, and we ignored them to our own peril.
Yeah. Well, what about Trump? So, if my memory serves me right, didn't Lance Wallnau make some prediction about Trump using like Isaiah 45 and tying him to King Cyrus or something?
Yeah, initially there was a publication in Charisma magazine in the summer of 2015. The guy's name, I believe it was Jeremiah Johnson, wrote about how God told him that Trump was going to be a Cyrus figure. He got laughed off the article got published, and I think it actually got deleted because he got laughed off so seriously. But then Lance Wallnau came out preaching the same thing, talking about the Cyrus anointing. And by this point, evangelicals were taking him seriously. He was becoming the front runner by that point. And so it was a lot harder to laugh it off then.
Before we started recording, you'd mentioned something about neo-Confederate, and I want you to kind of nerd out a little bit on this, because I don't know much about like neo-Confederate Christianity or anything like that. So like, can you tell us about sort of what's the neo-Confederate tie-in to Dominion?
Well, the easy answer is Doug Wilson. And there's a lot of other ways to approach this, and I discuss the other connections in American Dominion. But just because of the urgency of the moment, I think we really need to zero in on Doug Wilson and who he is and what he stands for. In the 1990s, he worked with another author. His name is slipping me at the moment. To write this booklet called Southern Slavery as It Was. At this point, he got picked up by John Piper around 2008, 2009, and that's when he started to become this superstar, when he should have been kept to his crazy corner. But then John Piper picked him up, and John Piper gave him his credibility, boosted him, and the rest is history, right? But he wrote this booklet called Southern Slavery as It Was. And it presented all of these myths about slavery as if they're actually true. Slaves had lives of ease and plenty. They had good health care. They had plenty of food. They had days off where they could just play with their kids. These stories about family separation and beatings and the brutality of life as a slave, these are just coming from people who want you to believe a liberal agenda. Right? It's not historically accurate. The book was plagiarized from a discredited source, right? Like this was not historically verifiable in any sense. But that was the introduction that a lot of people had to Doug Wilson. He had been building this empire in his hometown, Moscow, Idaho, not to be confused with Moscow, Russia. And what's really interesting to me is that this is 90 miles away from the Aryan Nation's headquarters at Hayden Lake. And he has, in his sermons and his blog, talked pretty sympathetically about Aryan nations. And as well as the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995 and the Ruby Ridge tragedy that occurred not too far from the Aryan Nation's headquarters. So Doug Wilson, he was known to fly Confederate flags at his church and at the day school that he operated. He was known to celebrate the birthday of Robert E. Lee instead of President's Day when we commemorate Abraham Lincoln. And so he was very avowedly using these neo-Confederate ideologies, but perhaps just as significantly as the overt neo-Confederacy is he was relying very much on the ideas of Francis John Rushdoony, who's the father of Reconstructionism. I can't call it Christian Reconstructionism, even though that's what other people call it, because it's just not, it doesn't look anything like Christ. Reconstructionism is a glorification of the Confederacy. It's basically an effort to recreate the Confederacy using other words, using other language. Rushdoony's one of his biggest influences was this guy named Robert Louis Dabney. He was the chaplain for a time to General Stonewall Jackson during the Civil War. He wrote wrote glowingly of the Confederacy as the world's Bible-based nation. Like, we've got it right. We're doing politics the way that the Bible says to do it. And it's overtly like about slavery. Like, that's what the Confederacy is about. And you have these little fiefdoms where with the the patriarchal father, his wife, I think Gone with the Wind, really, this glamorized notion of it, their kids, and then the slaves who are working the plantation. And this kind of does look in some ways like medieval Europe, at least at a glance. Looks like this these fiefdoms with serfs that are working the land. And Doug Wilson glorifies this. He, at his school, his college, students have said, we want to be medieval Protestants. Basically, we want to recreate the Middle Ages, but using Protestant instead of the dominant Catholic ideology that was present in the Middle Ages. All of these neo-Confederate influences just coalesce in everything that Doug Wilson is. And I hate to be alarmist. I'm so sorry about how much of what I'm saying has sounded alarmist, but I'm going to be alarmist here for a second. This neo-Confederate nut job has unprecedented influence over our nation's military, and that should be incredibly terrifying to anyone. I cannot hear you.
Oh, are you referring to the fact that Doug Wilson, as Pete Hegseth's, is it pastor or I don't know, like friend? I'm not really quite sure what that connection is.
Yeah, Doug Wilson has this little denomination that he oversees, and Pete Hegseth belongs to the Washington branch, the Washington church that's associated with Doug Wilson's movement.
So CREC, I think it's called.
Yeah, he's been giving prayers at the Pentagon and influencing Pete Hegseth. So it really is terrifying. I don't think we truly understand the level of influence that Doug Wilson actually has over Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon at this moment.
Wow. So there's a lot that you have said, and I'm imagining that you probably are not a lot of fun at parties when you talk about this stuff.
I try to just not talk about this stuff in my personal life. Sometimes people ask, and I'm like, you know what? Read the book.
Yeah, just read the book.
Just read the book. You can ask me about it afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, like help me understand. This is one of my last questions. Is if American dominion goes unchecked, meaning, all of the groups that we talked about kind of get their way. Like, what does America look like?
I think it's not just a question of what America is going to look like, but it's a question about what the rest of the world is going to look like, because this is a global movement. I called it American Dominion because I'm focusing particularly on the American component, but I don't want to miss the extent to which these guys are organizing in other countries. We can see how members of the Trump administration are allying with the far right in Europe. That's not an accident. That's a product of this movement and its global reach. And if I can recommend another book for a moment, The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart. Towards the end, she looks at the global nature of this movement. In American Dominion, I looked at Uganda, specifically the anti-gay legislation that was passed in Uganda, that in its current iteration, I mean, you can be killed maybe through vigilante violence, and then nobody's going to be prosecuted for it. And so you are being killed because of this anti-gay legislation that's been implemented. That's just the tip of what we're looking at if these guys truly have their way. And if they also have their way on an international scale, we will have nobody left to hold us accountable. I think right now we're just waiting and hoping that these other countries around the world that are allies, or once allies, are going to say no more and start to hold America accountable for the fact that we elected Trump a second time, for the actions of the Trump administration. We're seeing that starting to happen somewhat. Like China has pulled in some of its resources, tariffs on rare earth metals and such, but the ability of other countries to use any means to rein in what's happening in America is going to be completely depleted. There will be no more accountability, and these incredibly corrupt billionaires, alongside the apostles and prophets, many of whom are also just incredibly wealthy, are going to be at the head of a global oligarchy.
Well, on that happy note, Keri, where can people find your book? And when
You can go to the Bloomsbury website. It's published by Bloomsbury. And just search for American Dominion. You can also get it on Amazon, or you could request that your local bookstore order a copy. I would love for individuals who wish to read American Dominion support their local bookstore. Also, if you be a little bit broke, go to your public library and request that your public library order a copy.
Yeah, that's good advice. All of us be a little broke these days, I think.
We be feeling the broke right now, and
feeling the broke. One broke bro. Well, hey, thank you so much.
Use your public library.
Yeah, this has been a phenomenal chat. Thank you so much for your time and your work.
I wish it could be more uplifting. Hopefully we'll have better news next year at least after the midterms.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again for everything. And to our audience, thank you for stopping by again. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.